Hello, everyone. My name is Jordan Farmer. This is the Uncommon Conversations podcast, episode number 11. Today we have guest Zack Michaelson on. He is a professor at New York University, and he's an expert in finance and economics. He is a graduate of Harvard. He is a model, and he will be demystifying the Federal Reserve for us today, as well as what it means to have a balance sheet, expanding and contracting the balance sheet. And yeah, I'm very excited. He'll be on momentarily. So a while ago I was listening to a commentary panel on the Federal Reserve, and there was this guy who basically said nothing else matters in economics. Nothing else really matters in policy. Pretty much what determines the rate of growth in our economy is interest rates, and the interest rates that the Federal Reserve applies. And so as they raise interest rates and increase the cost of money, we tend to shortly thereafter see a collapse in the economy and sort of a reset. And then they lower the interest rates again, and we see, an expansion once again of the economic activity. And then as they begin to raise interest rates once again, we seem to see a crash again. And that was such an oversimplification, in my opinion, of economic policy, and I still stand by that criticism. But what's interesting is, upon looking at the data, he was very much right. What you see is that the Federal Reserve, when they do raise interest rates, do seem to cause some sort of an economic slowdown afterwards. There are many mechanisms behind why this might work, or why this might be happening. The most obvious one is just if you increase the cost of taking a loan, you're increasing the risk of not being able to pay it back, I guess. So you would have more people defaulting on those loans, and so on and so forth. Okay, Zach is in the chat. Zach, you'll just have to request to join. Right below your little icon that said you have now joined, shortly after, maybe 2 spaces down, is a little button to say request to join. Once you do that, you should be able to, there you go.
All right, hopefully we're all good.
Yeah, we made it through. Well, thank you so much for coming on, sir. It's an honor to have you.
Thank you for having me.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, thanks. Yeah, enjoying my summer.
Nice. That's good. I feel like you could do a better job than I can of giving yourself an introduction. So please give us your the rundown on you and what your.
Sure. Well, I guess
what you do.
if people are seeing this this page, Zack in Action is almost an alter ego of mine. I have a hobby doing in modeling and style influencer work and things like that, because that's kind of something completely different than what I do with most of the rest of my life, which is I work in finance. I'm a professor at NYU. I teach finance there, and I also work in industry. I do a lot of stuff with alternative investments, and hedge funds, bond trading, and I guess increasingly crypto, now that that's around, and things like that. So I develop artificial intelligence algorithms is a big part of what I do in the finance space. So a lot of stuff at the intersection of technology and economics and finance, and a lot of math. So doing this,
Everyone's favorite subject.
This Instagram profile is like kind of something completely different, and that's just kind of why I do it, because it's an opportunity to be visually creative, whereas most of the time I'm writing computer code and stuff like that. Or I've got 2 kids who are 8 or 9 and 11, so yeah. So that keeps my life busy otherwise. So, but you can see on Zack in Action and do something different sometimes. But I gather you want to talk about current events and things today.
Well, I mean, I'm definitely interested in all the aspects of your life. I think it's really cool and important to have those things that pull you in a different direction if you have that inclination towards a creative outlet.
Right.
to a certain degree, that's meaning in your life. And if you don't express it, you're leaving something on the table. And
Yeah, that's my thought too.
not that I'm great at utilizing this, but there are 168 hours in a week. And a lot of people don't do the math, the basic math on that, and look at like what they're actually doing with their week. So I think it's cool that you have that you have a creative outlet. That's what made you sort of get into it and everything. And
Right.
yeah, you're obviously doing well with it.
Yeah.
So on the family front, real quick, are you a single parent or are you in a two-parent?
Well, I've had a girlfriend for a couple of years now, so not very single.
Okay, right on. But are you pretty much raising your kids? Is it? I mean,
Yeah,
you don't
we
have to
live
let us
together.
in on the personal
Yeah,
side,
yeah.
but I'm just because there's a
No,
lot of
that's
people
right.
that deal with divorce and single parenthood and
Yeah,
stuff. So
no,
I'm
that's right.
just curious
I got divorced. I got divorced 6 years ago, but it's been in another serious relationship now for several years, and got a sort of full family situation
nice.
going.
Well, I'm very happy to hear that for you. That's one of the most important things in life for sure. You can find success in some other areas, but if that's lacking, there's not for everybody, but definitely
Yeah,
for most people, I feel like that's a very important thing. So
oh, for sure. Yeah,
when it's lacking, it's
we all want love and companionship and things like that. It's an important part
yeah,
of life. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, I do want to jump into the meat and potatoes of it, so to speak. So what first off, I think the best thing to do would be to try to define what a central bank is in contrast to what other forms of banking might be, or at least just to establish a concept of what a central bank looks like and operates like.
Yeah, right. So central banks were, it's sort of the first one was the Bank of England that was developed in the late 1700s. Our Federal Reserve was created by Congress in 1913. So the question is why, and it's really originally to control or be able to help manage the money supply, and to in some ways help facilitate the government's paying of and paying and receiving, as essentially assisting in the treasury function, as well as assisting certain functions of the banking system as well. So there's a couple of reasons that they've evolved into creating, and most of those were kind of there towards the beginning. And again, that's really sort of to be the bank of the government itself, right? So the one of the best ways to think of our Federal Reserve, for instance, is as the bank of the U.S. government. That's basically what it is the bank of the U.S. government. And so then the question is, what would the bank of the U.S. government do? So it's where the U.S. government would need to, keep any of its money or write any of its checks or something like that. And the Federal Reserve does do that purpose for the U.S. government. It operates as its bank. So somewhat confusingly, the U.S. government, and especially its subsidiary entities or something like that, might have bank accounts at commercial banks or something like that. But those would need to get funded out of the Fed, and it's not mostly what happened. Most of the time, like if you received a stimulus check or something like that, right? It says it's from the U.S. Treasury, but ultimately, it doesn't say like Bank of America at the top. It says from the U.S. Treasury, and so then that's got to get cleared against a Federal Reserve account. That's where they keep their money, so they operate in that function. Then they do some other functions for the banking system in general. So clearing, for instance, clearing checks is one of the primary ones. That was one of the original ones that was developed. So so originally, without any sort of central bank, you would need to have some way of transferring money around the banks, clearing checks. If I give you money and, we did it based upon a draft on on a bank account, then, what happens when I, for instance, write you a check or now, Venmo or anything else, the idea is that takes money out of my bank account and puts it into your bank account, right? So then somehow our banks have to communicate with each other, right? That's what we mean when we say clearing, right? When we talk about check clearing or something like that. Now,
the little ACH short thing is all clearinghouse, right? Or something clearinghouse?
Yeah, exactly. Right. But so a clearinghouse is really just a way of centralizing that, because, what I was going to say is, like, in the old days, you might have, like, messenger boys, like, running around town, like, with slips to let, everybody know about the, withdrawals and deposits. And this is what they did in the original banking systems, and through, like, for instance, the Middle Ages and that kind of thing into Renaissance times. Then they started developing clearinghouses around the 1600s or something like that in Europe, which is really recognizing, it would be more efficient than having, like, teenage boys run all around town. What if we all just met, like, at an agreed time in an agreed place with all of our slips, and then we can just, like, all exchange them with each other, right? So, originally this is what the original clearinghouse was. It was like a room. Originally, I think the rumors were they were doing this, like, I think if you read it in the history books, like in coffee shops and pubs and stuff like that. So, like, I think in London, like, the original clearinghouses were like pubs that they would meet at, and, like, at lunchtime, and all, like, agree, let's go to, like, the back room of the pub and we'll all bring our deposit slips. And then, things progressively got more professionalized. And then ultimately, clearinghouses began to be able to serve some other functions, not only to, make for, a safe way of exchanging, the information, but also providing sort of some verification of it, as well as basically making sure that people would be good for it, like, posting some sort of collateral, right? Like, if we've got this, even still this problem of, like, if I write you a check, you don't know if the check might bounce or something like that. That would be a problem for banks, obviously, if banks are clearing checks against each other all the time, and if they don't know what if the other bank isn't good for it, which hopefully most of the time doesn't happen, but it could, right? So clearinghouses can step in the middle of this sort of situation and make sure, because they can see what everybody's got, or they can require everybody to hold something, on deposit, to make sure that, given the volume of what they've got coming in and out, that they're going to be good for it, right? So clearinghouses can serve that function. And that's at the core of what the central banks are doing, because they are now the clearinghouse for all of the banks, right? So they're going to, make sure that that banks can be good for it. And the way that they do that is by requiring some reserves, right? Which originally, you can imagine, sort of in the 1700s, like, if people were exchanging, slips that are worth gold or something like that, right? One easy way to solve, to make sure that you're going to be good for the net balance between the gold you received and the gold you paid out on any given day, is if everybody is required to have, like, some amount of gold, like, in a secure locker at the clearinghouse, right? And you say, oh, okay, well, I know that because you have a certain amount of gold, well, you're going to have slips that pay out gold, but you've got slips that receive gold, and because I know you have a certain amount of gold, I'm going to trust that you're good for the ones that you pay out, right?
So to try to put it maybe in solid terms, you're essentially saying, like, if the low range and the top range of the transfers in a given day is, like, say, 100 units to 500 units, if you keep 600 units in deposit, you can swing that whole, or something like that. You can swing that fluctuation.
Now you're getting into the mechanics of essentially what central bank risk analysts do, right? Or at least historically have done, to try to do that sort of exercise, right? To try to figure out what should reserve requirements be. And for that matter, there are people who devoted their entire careers to getting in depth on the question that you were trying to answer there, which is what would be the appropriate way to figure out how much banks should keep on reserve.
Well, no, I wasn't so much. Well, see, you're assuming I'm more informed and asking a more informed question than I am. I was just saying, is that the essential conceptual mechanism of what you're talking about just now is there's some range of ultimate transactions they're going to have to clear, and so by holding an amount close to or some amount there for a regular period of time, that's how they do that. Yeah. In terms of the amount, I was just throwing out numbers. I was not.
That's true. Yeah.
Getting
Now,
any deeper
I
points.
like to give historical context. Though I should note that it is confusing to give historical context because people imagine the current system to be a modernized extension of the way things began, and it's not. So like I think, for instance, people imagine the banking system in almost in the way of like just a modern version of like the 1600s, like London gold merchants system or something like that. And they figure that banks and central banks must be doing something that is just like a high-tech version of 17th century England gold merchant. And it's not. So a lot of the assumptions that people have, for instance, about reserve management at banks or the Federal Reserve's money supply or the government's money or any of these things no longer have anything to do with what they did in history, and it really stopped having anything to do with that about 100 years ago, and hard, fast stopped as of 1971. Basically, the United States went off with the gold standard in 1933, and the European nations had done it in 32 preceding. We were not one of the first ones to go off of the gold standard, just maybe one of the more important ones. But the gold standard is also highly misunderstood. People think that the gold standard is something that like existed for hundreds of years, and it was like this natural thing. And then when we went off of it, it was like
gold's always been the best money. Yeah.
Well, it was a brief experiment that failed and created the Great Depression. The gold standard existed only for a couple of years prior to the Great Depression, and it was largely what caused the Great Depression. It was an experiment that started in the late 1920s and then collapsed by the early 1930s. It had been tried also once before at a global scale in the early 1900s and then collapsed again. Not again. The first time it collapsed was in World War I and was a precipitating factor of World War I. So there were really kind of two brief experiments with the gold standard on either side of World War I. But this idea that it failed abysmally and is the primary cause of the Great Depression, which is not widely understood by I think the layman understanding of history. I think that the layperson thinks that maybe the stock market crash of 1929 or something caused the Great Depression. Not largely true. It doesn't coincide with when the Depression the Depression was.
I feel like most political accounts of what happened with the Great Depression are very much lacking. And you touched on a few different historical points: the Federal Reserve, and then from I think it was you said 1933 to 1970, we went from like $1 per gold ounce to $35 per gold ounce or something, and so there was like that sliding period.
But between 1933 and World War II, there was a sort of struggling gold system where the gold standard had been broken both in the U.S. and Europe, and then it was kind of a free for all of just sort of reassigning currency values to gold. For instance, in the U.S., FDR was doing that, and it was not a viable long-term system. So famously, the nations of the world met in 1944 in New Hampshire at a resort that is still around, is still a popular vacation resort. It's called Bretton Woods. And so they met and created an international monetary system that the United States really wanted to be based around the U.S. dollar rather than around gold. And the rest of the world really wanted to be gold, and in particular, John Maynard Keynes, who was representing the Kingdom, wanted it to be there to be some sort of international non-dollar standard. He kind of wanted something that was not neither gold nor dollar, that he called Bancor, and that didn't happen. Largely because
that's interesting, because I've thought about that being kind of an obvious, especially for international pricing, like having an individual currency being the main mechanism of international pricing instead of an international currency or some sort of international thing. It it's never really made sense to me. But
no, exactly. And that's a project that I'm working on myself in industry. No such thing as an international currency exists. But part of the core. Yeah, right. Right. I mean, I'm trying to work on it, but the issue is that the question of what is a currency, right? So what is money, right? So it's a liability. It's just something that says that someone owes somebody something else, right? So U.S. dollars are just liabilities of our government, right? Mm-hmm. So when we were on the gold standard, the idea was they were still liabilities of the government. However, there was some reserve of this arbitrary metal, right? And it was that they said, well, for a brief period of time, they experimented around with the idea of, okay, well, if you wanted, you could exchange liabilities of the government for some amount of this arbitrary metal. Well, we could go in depth into why that doesn't work, but the core concept is that the government loses all ability to control policy because now they're tied to the amount of this arbitrary metal, and then another problem is it creates this competitive dynamic between nations, about gold reserves and things like that, which ends up being.
And I guess here's a good place to step back and just say, like, money is just a means of calculating value, and like humans are ultimately what give the currency money. If someone tried to pay you in something and you did not consider it viable currency, it's not viable currency. So
right. Well, there's this famous quote.
It doesn't have to be gold to be something that people will get something for. So you can. So there's a way to get around that.
The quote: "It's easy to create money. The hard part is getting it accepted."
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, I like that.
Right. The point is that money is just an IOU, right? So if I get a Post-it note and say, I owe you this, right? You could take that Post-it note and trade it with somebody else, and I would effectively use it as money. Now, to bring the point home, there are other forms of money that are, starting to exist and take place. Really, like, for instance, gift cards, right? So, for instance, Amazon liabilities. So, like, if you have a gift card, a $25 Amazon gift card, that's a liability of Amazon. Amazon owes you $25 worth of stuff, right? And in certain cases, there are times where we prefer to use an Amazon gift card than actual U.S. dollar liabilities, than U.S. government liabilities, as a gift. For some reason, like, if you fill out a survey and they give you something that's associated with that, or you participate in an experiment at a university and, fill out information, whatever. Those sorts of things, for whatever reason, it's a psychological, sociological thing. I mean, we understand, I think, all intuitively why there are certain circumstances why a gift card feels more appropriate than cash. But my point is to draw it home that this is also money, right? That liabilities,
it's tied to the dollar, but it's Taco Bell bucks.
Yeah, right. Liabilities from anybody is money, right? Well, it doesn't. Yeah, you're right. It's tied to the dollar. It's pegged, right? But no dollars need to be exchanged. Is the point? Dollars don't even need to exist because that gift card is going to be exchanged, directly for goods from Amazon. So there don't need to be dollars that exist for that transaction to take place. However, the value of the goods that it entitles me to is tied to the U.S. dollar. So that would be an example of like a pegged currency. It's Amazon gift cards is kind of not different than Bahamian dollars or the currency in Costa Rica or something like that. Which is tied to the dollar, right? So money is just a liability, and so therefore, sort of bringing it home to the central bank. The central bank has the function now of creating the government's money. So not only do they hold on to it, but they create it, basically, right? So it's really this blended process, because it's odd. What do we mean by create? Technically, the dollar bills are not printed by the Federal Reserve. They're printed by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing, which is part of the U.S. Treasury. But if you look on a dollar bill, it says Federal Reserve note, right? Mm-hmm. So it's really just that the Treasury is operating as Kinko's or something like that for the Federal Reserve. And yet at the same time, the Federal Reserve is operating as the banker of the government. So it's this very intimate, relationship. So technically, the central bank is sort of supposed to be this independent organization, and not be part of the federal government. But
its mandates are determined by Congress, correct? Like they could change that.
Well, sort of.
There's banking
the Board of
mandates
Governors
essentially by the business, but
right. The Board of Governors is appointed by the president, and then has to be approved by Congress. In the same way that like a judge would be, or something like that. It's an odd thing, if you get into like sort of the legality of the central bank, that they ostensibly, should be under more congressional review, you would think, ostensibly, because their mandate is not set by Congress. It's not necessarily that we want it to be politically controlled, but at the same time, constitutionally speaking, we don't have anything else like this where they're like their own thing, and can do whatever they want, right?
So
like the military, for instance, at the end of the day, like we can't just say, oh, well, we appoint the generals and the generals can do whatever the hell they want. No, there still is a chain of command, and the military does serve at the behest of the executive. The central bank does not serve at the behest of the government. There's only this link that they have to be appointed, and they have to testify to Congress, and they can be heckled by Congress, as they sometimes are, but they're ultimately not like directly responsible in the way that
most of that is a show, people. Just for anyone watching, most of that is a show. Most of the angry, like if they ultimately vote them in 98-2 or something like that, it was all a show for the most part there.
Yeah,
it's just like they have to make it look like they're really pushing hard against whoever's in office, and then they just let them on through. Because there's been some issues with some of, not to get political, this is just a side note, but certain Biden appointees, problems were brought up that were, to me, like worthy of dismissing them as a viable candidate, and they still got through. And they were brought up by certain people, and so it's like, even when they make good points, it doesn't matter. Like it's just kind of a process. So.
Yeah, political appointment has gotten increasingly political, and and sort of in a shallow way, where legitimate problems are brought up with appointments and they still get in, and then probably even more examples of situations where appointments were held up, and it had nothing to do with any problem with the candidate. It was just held up for political reasons.
And there's a great little side note here. I looked into the timelines just for one of the lies of Trump. Food for the sharks or whatever. He actually got his appointments in for his cabinet and whatnot faster than other presidents. So he was complaining at the beginning about it happening too slowly, and I think what happened is they made it happen faster in reaction to him complaining, and so maybe that's why he complained. But anyways,
I mean, there's been some difference of opinion between the parties. I mean, I think many, some of these political tactics in Washington are something that whichever party is in power is going to do. There are some of them that aren't adopted as much, and it's by both parties. And it seems that, it seems that Democrats have not seen an upside as much in like the just mass holding up the general appointments, because it holds up sort of the functioning of government, and it's sort of easy to see where over the long run, like who holds the White House is going to flip parties, and people have a memory, right? So if you did, if you were an asshole, 4 years ago, on when the other guys tried to just get government running, and you wouldn't allow the ambassador to France to be appointed or something, and it's and then people are going to remember that, right? And, I think, so hopefully both parties would remember, but I think there's maybe some of that.
Definitely the people in the whatever 4,000 people closest to all that activity, they all remember. Joe Schmo, it doesn't pay attention to most of that stuff, but yeah.
Right, exactly. And so there's a thing in Washington about whether whether there's any reciprocity, any tit for tat, whether you can ever say, okay, well, this is below the belt. Like, we may not agree about certain things, but like, we both agree at various points where both parties are going to hold the White House, and we can't not allow anything to happen just because our guy didn't win or something,
Yeah. I'm really part of what I'm doing here with my own political content, but also I think just what we're moving to. I think I'm kind of following a trend. I'm not so much trying to be a groundbreaking whatever. So much of politics is process. So much of politics is that just letting government function. So much of what we're arguing about all the time is not anything worth arguing over, really. And stuff that people don't disagree on. No one wants a bad economy, right? So it's apply the best principles by the economists that know the best thing, and it's not that much more complicated than that. So, I think it'd be nice to see the politicians also move in that direction, where all that process stuff just gets handled as seamlessly and as quickly as possible.
Yeah, I think the issue that continues to go on here is what in economics, what we call an iterative prisoner's dilemma. So there's this concept in economics called the prisoner's dilemma. It's if you saw A Beautiful Mind, about sort of the foundations of game theory. And so the idea is, imagine two prisoners that are apprehended by the police, and they're held in separate rooms, and they're trying to get each prisoner to defect on his other guy, right? So they imagine payouts to this of saying, if neither one defects, then they both get the best possible outcome, right? Now, in the exact prisoner story, they'll say, imagine that if neither of you defect, then sometimes they'll say the story is you both get off. Sometimes they'll say, they've got enough evidence to get you, for breaking and entering, but not the more serious crime. So both of you will get 1 year or something like that, but not a more serious, right? And they say, well, but the prosecutor is offering you a deal that if you defect on the other guy, then you get nothing and he gets 10 years, right? But if you both take the deal, then you both get 7 years or 10 years or whatever, right? You can, play around with the parameters. But the point is, if you both defect, then it ends up being bad. But there's this incentive to defect because you can get a better deal by being the one who defects, but the other one doesn't, right? So I think that there's this problem often in public policy where it ends up being a prisoner's dilemma type situation where people have to ask themselves, do I want to go for the option that is maybe worse for others because it would be better for me, right? Or go for the option that is maybe, worse, slightly worse for me, if we all say we're in the same boat, but it's way better than us all just defecting on each other. So, do we want to be, regarding other people, or, do we want to defect? So maybe like some simple example would be like, how much do I care about like poverty or something like that? So you might say, well, if I pay taxes for like poverty and I'm not somebody who's in poverty, then that makes me like a little worse off, right? Because like I pay taxes that, so that was like a little bit less money for me. But, but maybe we say that that's like a prisoner's dilemma situation, because like if we all refuse to help anyone in poverty, then it makes all of society worse off or something like that. And it would be, sort of like, even
part of the prisoner's dilemma is you don't know which pin is going to drop.
Yeah, right.
If there's multiple people.
The critical
So
thing
with
is you don't know what
the
other guy's
poverty and rich thing, it's like sometimes you fall on your back and you end up poor. So you don't know when you might be the one. So you have that incentive to say, on the 2% chance everything falls apart, I'm hedging my bets, basically.
Yeah, exactly. That's a very good point, and deeply related to, for instance, the way the philosophers in the 20th century, like John Rawls, were encouraging people to think about it, to think about public policy problems, is to imagine, well, you might not be handicapped now, but imagine that there's a chance that you could be when thinking about how you want to make handicap policy, right? Sure, you could adopt the line, oh, I don't want to like put ramps on curbs because I'm not in a wheelchair and that's going to cost me tax dollars or something like that. But you go, think about that for a second. Car crashes do happen, and I hate to tell you, but you could be in a wheelchair next year. Just saying, I hope you're good, but you might want there to be a ramp there, and you might be like, I hate this town. They don't even put in ramps, when you end up being the unfortunate guy who was in the car accident, right? Like, so you raise exactly the right point philosophically. They encourage us to think that you could be reassigned to be anybody else in society. Now, of course, that's a nice philosophical exercise, but we run into the practicality that, for instance, we say, well, I'm not going to be reassigned to be a refugee from El Salvador or Afghanistan. I know that, right? Yeah. Like, I live in the Midwest. I'm a white guy or something, right? So I'm not going to.
It's not something that it's something that was at the beginning. It's not something that's going to intervene in any other state.
Right. It's hard to get people to care about, little girls who are refugees from El Salvador, or women in Afghanistan right now, or something else. When you say, that's a very philosophical point, to imagine myself as a woman in Afghanistan, because I know I'm not going to be one, right?
Yeah. You're operating exclusively in abstractions at that point. Like,
right.
There's nothing in your life you can actually
tie
into that experience.
So people are naturally going to regard that differently. And I think some public policy problems come down to where you fall on that, whether you say, whether you're able to step outside of yourself and say, yeah, I'm never going to be an Afghan woman, but that doesn't mean that I don't care about their fate. And then other people are going to say, a more self-regarding preference, and say, it's not the job of the government with my tax dollars to care about, El Salvadoran refugees or Afghan women, or, those are my tax dollars. I should decide what to do with them, or something like that, which there's an argument for that as well, right? But I think a lot of things come down to that. And then I think, interestingly and unfortunately, that there are many situations where public policy will opt for the worst situation for everybody, just so that some other people don't benefit, right? And there's been some fascinating discussion on this. There's a book written on race. I'll pull it up for you, about all these examples of this sort of thing, where mostly it was like throughout the 20th century, but some of them still exist today. This sort of paradigm was the swimming pools in the South. I'll get.
You might just be buffering. We might have lost him permanently, but there you are. You're back.
Yeah, I definitely recommend it. To anyone. But I can give you the teaser on her paradigm examples. Was stuff like the swimming pools in the 1950s in the South and the 60s when they ordered desegregation.
You cut out for a second, so if you describe
Oh,
whatever book
sorry.
it was,
Probably
I
because
get
I
it.
was looking. It was probably because I was looking at the book. All right, so the name is "The Sum of Us" by Heather McGee. Yeah, sorry, switching apps to make sure I got the author's name right. Yeah, so it's the Sum of Us by Heather McGee, and it's I would definitely recommend it to you all. I think the paradigm examples that she's sort of giving, of things that amount to this sort of defect in the prisoner's dilemma is like the treatment of the swimming pools in the Deep South in the 1950s and 60s when they ordered desegregation, when they said, the swimming pool in Montgomery, Alabama, you can't say it's an all-white swimming pool. No longer can you do that. Well, you know what they chose to do? They said, well, then we'll fill in the swimming pool with concrete. No swimming pool, right? And it was not just Montgomery, Alabama. There were hundreds of swimming pools all throughout the South and Midwest that got filled in with concrete rather than the town allowing it to be a multiracial swimming pool, right? So, yeah, it's head-shaking examples, and yet you find that there were many of these situations, and many that still do continue today, where people say, if it's going to benefit the other people who aren't me, especially if it's going to benefit the other people that I hate, whether I want to say it or not, then I prefer it not even exist, right? And so examples that I think exist today are, for instance, government programs that would generally benefit the middle class or the lower middle class, right? Or lower incomes, right? So the majority of low-income people in the United States are white, but many low-income white people are against the very programs that would benefit them, which is opposite to what you learn in political science. Political science tells you people will vote in their own best interests, right? And yet people are not generally supportive of programs that are technically in their own economic best interest. And one of the reasons is related to the swimming pool thing, where people are against programs that they think are going to benefit other people that they have a problem with, right? So, and it especially, relates, it's in these opinions that especially relate to the exact same counties that build in the swimming pools, right? So, opposition to, to labor unions or to, government assistance programs or to spending more money on schools or, these sorts of things.
And just to play the moderate that I love to play.
Yes.
And I grew up on the right politically. I had many right-wing people in my circle. I think ultimately most of the motivation comes from the idea that those programs don't work, or that those programs. So like on what was the one you mentioned before the welfare programs? I'm sorry.
Oh, like labor unions or something like that?
Labor unions, okay. Yeah, like on that point, there's lots of objections to labor unions' influence over policy and mandates from government as a distinct from the existence of unions. Because I think anyone that's against the existence of unions is just it's an absurd concept to say people can't come together and act as a collective voluntarily. That would be the most ridiculous concept ever.
Of course, it's a fair point that any institution struggles with efficiency. So there's going to be no government program where it has, a perfect track record, and for sure, any program, including these, it's not hard to point to a ton of examples of situations where it wasn't efficient or it had problems or something like that,
or perverse incentives is another big one.
Yeah, right, and you could, likewise with the military or, construction.
Wall Street or whatever. There's tons of perverse incentives in the system.
Yeah, exactly. Any big institution, you're going to say, you can very easily come up with examples where it didn't work, or where there were bad incentives or something like that. But there's also been sort of a systematic part of American politics for those who are for those for whom those programs would not benefit, which is to say basically wealthy America, to sort of really try to convince lower income America of this point that it doesn't work. Because if they thought that it would work, then rich people would be outnumbered in the voting, right? So, you see this sort of, billions of dollars poured in by, certain billionaires, like, say, the Koch brothers or something like that, towards programs to swing opinion really in the direction that you're saying.
It's
saying,
controversial to bring this guy up because there's the automatic, are you an anti-Semite? But another billionaire that's always brought up, and it's because Alex Jones mostly mentioned him, it's very taboo, but George Soros is a great left-wing example of a billionaire doing very much the same thing. Now, he's more targeted on district attorneys, but still.
He is trying to, sway opinions. I think not, I was sort of speaking about a particular opinion, which is the opinion that government programs, including and especially government programs that might ostensibly help lower income people,
they tell them that they can't, or that it's somehow immoral.
Yeah, exactly right. Exactly. So advancing that really helps move the needle for the program that the wealthy people might otherwise want by helping bring on board lower income Americans who might otherwise support these programs if they thought that they worked and that they were moral. So, it's helpful to their agenda if you can help, swing it that way.
And it is important.
Agendas, it's just not that one.
Yeah. Marxism, unfortunately, makes sort of a totalizing argument about class interest.
Right.
And I'm much more of a all philosophies are tools through which to look, like prisms through which to observe certain things. The class point and saying that you should be concerned about class interests in your conception of economics, I think it's absolutely true. You should be looking at it as a laborer versus capitalist. That's how I distinguish it: laborer versus capitalist, or laborer versus ownership. Sort of, those are the two tribes of economics, and there's overlap because, like, Jeff Bezos is also trading his labor for a return. It's just a much different type of return, a different composition of the return, different economic tools. But I don't like to. That's why I negate the Marxists, because they're very much like, screw the rich, the capitalist class. And I'm like, they're still trading their time for a return, and there's nothing wrong with ambition or success. It's just when they then use those mechanisms, or the government has already been warped in such a way that it's benefiting them at the expense of us systemically, then you have a real issue. So
I think you have a nice distinction there about the difference between recognizing that that socioeconomic differences exist and that's relevant in understanding public policy, and that's necessary, versus
we don't have to be pinned against
political ideology, right? Like, say Marxism or something like that, which is a political ideology, and that those two things are very different, right? Like, discussing socioeconomic aspects to politics or to public policies is natural and necessary, and it does not mean that you espouse one particular politics. Certainly not espousing Marxism or something like that, right? So nice distinction there, because in the social media, in the Twitter sphere, people just immediately
I always try to approach these various little sections of the body politic as, and this is my personality, mines, or sort of basically coal mines, but for ideas. And there's some sort of potentially good, substantive, or insightful ideas that can come from pretty much any source. And that's why I'm a moderate politically, is that I think if you listen to everybody, then you're getting the most exposure and casting the widest net to hopefully catch the best breadth of good ideas. It's very easy to go deep in one area, but it's very emotionally difficult to listen to the people that you would rather not listen to under any circumstances.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, I think the takeaway from what we were saying, and what I think moderates can do, is try to recognize these prisoner's dilemma situations, these situations where we'd all be better off by cooperating rather than defecting on each other, right? And trying to look at each of these sort of public policy issues and questions that are in front of us and ask ourselves, would we be better off, being selfish, each of us, or is there some policy, is there some avenue that is asking us to not be selfish? And while for certain people in the group, that might be, worse for them individually because, let's say they have to pay a tax or something like that, that in general, it's better if we all cooperate or something like that. And, so I think there are lots of these popping up around. And I tend to find that the people who opt for I'm looking out for me, and if that means that I defect on you, that means that I defect on you, and so be it. If that's their answer on one issue, it tends to be that's often what they say about lots of issues. And
to bring in a little personality science, that could largely be a function of just disagreeable people versus agreeable people.
Yeah, it could be, and right. I try to not be one of those, and I think to some extent, in giving people the benefit of the doubt, it might sometimes have to do with like role of government question, where people might at a local or personal level not act that way, but when it comes to what's the role of the government, they want to act in like in a selfish way because that's that has a smaller concept of the government. They say
So on that point, it's an interesting thing. Now the right is more religious. Oh, sorry.
Yeah, right, exactly right. Religious people might, I could imagine somebody who says, I'm very generous in my community and I do charity work with my church every Sunday. But if you ask them anything about like refugees or welfare or anything, they say, no, you should.
Yeah. Well, like in the Christian faith, you give 10% of your money to the church. So it's like, I was going to say, statistically, right, conservatives tend to give more to charity on average, but I think tithing is calculated into that to a certain degree.
You're right. That has been studied. Exactly. When you take the tithing out, right? When you take out religious donations, it's slightly less for conservatives because it's noticeably more in general if you count religious donations. But then once you
but there is that clear contrast between the mandate of 10% given versus I'm not going to give you any of my money because you're just a freeloader. Like those are like different levels of reality, but those are conflicting visions of how to operate in them.
Right, exactly. So there are and always have been a lot of questions about how much we regard other people and whether we think we want our society and our government institutions to be helping others, and what's the right way to do that? And it's not always sort of easy answers, right? Take say refugees or something like that. There's this fundamental question of, do we even want our government to help refugees? To help people from other countries who are seeking.
Do we accept them? How many do we accept them?
Exactly
Where
right.
from?
Yeah, exactly.
Under what circumstances?
Right. So some people just don't even think we should do it. But then even if you think we should, there are still like logistical questions, right? This issue about whether you think there's a crisis at the border and what you think the crisis is, right? So if you think the crisis is about people getting in, then you're of the mind that we shouldn't be having them and the government should be letting people in. If you think the crisis at the border is that people are escaping gang violence in El Salvador, and then when they get here, then they're held in detention camps, other people say that's the crisis at the border. And then those naturally are people who are saying, that they are of the mind that our government should be trying to help, refugees. And then, of course, there's this practical problem of, okay, well, what exactly should we be doing with refugees when they get here? And
what are the consequences of doing that?
Yeah, right. Because and
now this is a universal but sort of a challenge.
It might be mostly teenagers who are in need of help, but how do you make sure that there aren't any bad actors who are slipping in and pretending to be,
Because I think people coming over the southern border are from over 100 countries, so it's not like it's really one particular type of individual or type of region. It's a whole breadth of variety of people.
For sure. I mean, it is exactly. But at the same time, I mean, the vast majority are from.
It's mostly Central America, yeah.
Yeah, and really at that, it's mostly El Salvador. El Salvador is really, in a tough. I mean, to some extent Honduras, but it's even though they're coming over the Mexican border, it's not significantly Mexican. I mean, there are some spots in Mexico that are rough, but Mexico is a developed country, and the thing is, it's not that in all circumstances somebody would be better off, in the United States than they would be in Mexico. If you're going to be a low wage, worker in farming, it's not that you earn like vastly more in California than you do in Baja California or something like that. Now, not necessarily so if in El Salvador, and also not necessarily so if you think you are for sure going to die at the hands of gang violence if you stay, right?
Yeah.
Which applies in some places in Mexico for sure, and a whole bunch of places in San Salvador and Tegucigalpa.
A quick point. I don't want to get bogged down into deep political foreign policy discussions, but it is very frustrating me to see Kamala Harris going over there and making it about sort of the poor conditions there, instead of understanding that the only role the government can play, especially the national government can play, especially the president specifically, is on the foreign policy front and in trying to influence the governments of those nations to change what they're doing. Yeah. I don't like that. I don't really know what other than optics, but on both ends. So like the right was attacking her for not doing the right optical thing, going to the border or doing whatever, and then now she did the right thing or went there, and then they're like, oh, she's just doing it for the optics. So you can't win. But but I definitely think that like the only solution there is trying to get the systems in those countries to get their game together, and applying pressure to do so. Facilitate help where you can, but if we don't solve that, we're not solving the long-term issues. So, and I'm all for the short-term support, but it's short-term support. It's not long-term solution.
It's a tricky question of how our government should be involved in other governments. And you said it right that there's often you're going to take flack either way, right? That's the main flaw
in politics when you're doing things for the appearance of it, or doing things for the optics of it, or doing things for the sake of making people feel the right way. Like, you have to do that to some degree, I guess. But I really, personally, and I don't know, I'm at the point where I feel like I reject that entirely. You're much better off just trying to be a good actor and being honest, and you'll buy a lot more currency with people with authenticity than you do with the games at this point.
Okay, fine, but also, look, big picture there. There's a real dark history with the United States and Central America and South America with being more than optics and actually trying to, manipulate and bolster their institutions. Because, sometimes we're the bad actor, or at least historically have been in Central America. And
sometimes
South America.
When we're applying pressure, it's around the neck.
Right. Well, or like if we're trying to pick winners in their political system, sometimes the guy we pick is a bad guy. It's for instance, historically been for particular political motives that we pick a guy, and for instance, often throughout the 20th century, there was this theory, this domino theory, that communism was going to spread around the world like dominoes collapsing. So we would just kind of look at everything through that lens, which in hindsight it was deeply flawed and caused a lot of problems and caused a lot of war.
I'm so sorry. Instagram has me tied to 1 hour at a time. So I'm going to have to jump off and we'll hop back on.
All right, no problem.
All right, I appreciate it very much.